it's hard. I mean, it's really hard to reconcile the two of them, both the free speech and allowing people to say what they want with also keeping it from harming people.
Thank you so much, and I know I speak for the panelists when I thank the JCC for its hospitality. It's a hot topic on a cold night, and I know we can look forward to some really provocative conversation. We're also looking forward to your questions at the end of the program, but I want to start, although we've got a panel laden with a lot of learning, professorial and otherwise, about cyber threats. I want to start with the personal and ask each of you to talk a little bit about the experiences you've had as the recipient of cyber trolling. Hadas, can you talk to us about your experience?
Sure. As a reporter, you get a lot of emails and a lot of tweets and Facebook's messages. I mean, we make our contact information very public because that's part of what we need to do in order to get sources, get tips, get information, and sometimes the reader emails can get kind of nasty. I do have to say the vast majority of the reader emails I get are more of like, you're a liberal, you're a conservative, blah, 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 you hate Trump, you love Trump, whatever that might be. But I've gotten, there was a period of time prior to the election where I was getting a spate of anti-Semitic messages. There was one of my now former colleagues, Julia Yaffe, also got some of them. And there was like a period of like 24 hours where they were a little bit targeted, where they were taking, you know, my face and superimposing like bullet wounds on them, or putting my face on real photos of Holocaust victims. And so that's jarring. A lot of that stuff actually wasn't public. What had happened is I posted just one of them on my Facebook page, just being like, this is what I'm getting. And without me really knowing, it kind of got around and it kind of blew up and everybody wrote about it. But the vast majority of even the worst ones I didn't publicize because I didn't want to publicize them, and because, as I'm sure you all can talk about better than I can, we were trying to get Twitter to pull these accounts down. And we were told that if we didn't, if these were getting publicized, it was harder to somehow justify it to them to get it to be taken down. And so that's why I kept it. And also, it's not very nice to see your picture like that being everywhere now. If you Google my name, it's like one of the top things that pops up. Thankfully, as a reporter, I have enough results that it will get pushed down eventually. But it, you know, and I still to this day will often get just in my mentions, like Twitter mentions about it. That one incident in October was the most targeted that I probably had received. But I never, and maybe it's just I've developed thick skin for being a reporter. I was never particularly worried about it. What concerned me actually more was how my family and my friends were reacting to it. They were getting very nervous about it. Getting calls from my grandmother in Israel who had escaped Poland when she was 5 years old. That was probably harder than having the HR conversations with my workplace about how to handle it. And I mean, like I said, to this day, I'll still sometimes get some Twitter messages about it. But it's never, it's pretty run-of-the-mill. They can be sometimes repetitive and lazy about it, so.
Well, I mean, it's a horrifying story to hear in the first instance, but I know you're not alone. Marianne, you have had parallel experiences.
I've had a few experiences that stand out, I guess you could say. A few years ago when I started work on an issue called revenge porn, some of you may have heard of that, I was helping state legislatures think about ways to pass legislation to try to put a stop to this privacy violation.
Can I just interrupt for a second? Because some people may not know what that is.
Certainly,
and
yes.
I think it's worth explaining.
So it's a kind of a slang term, but the term revenge porn usually refers to the non-consensual distribution of private photos, usually nude photos or sexually explicit photos. And what happens in many cases is that these photos are distributed either to personal friends and family or coworkers of a person, or they end up on what's called revenge porn sites. And basically these are porn sites, but the people who are featured on them have not consented to be there. Some of you may have been keeping up with a recent story from a couple weeks ago called Marines United, involving a scandal like this in the military. But this issue began making a lot of headlines several years ago, and I was working with Dr. Holly Jacobs, who herself had been a victim of this conduct, and we had started this initiative that was dedicated to trying to combat this form of abuse and other forms of abuse. And we were just at the very beginning of trying to focus on that specific issue and talking about the ways that states could respond to this problem. And I received an email then this was kind of an unusual email because I saw that it was delivered through it was a Tor email address. And Tor, as some of you probably know, is an anonymizing software, and it masks the person's actual IP address, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to trace. And this message, I think I'll always remember what this message said. It said, I'm going to find you, I'm going to kidnap you, I'm going to rape you, I'm going to take pictures of it, and I'm going to put it all over the internet so that you stop doing what you're doing. That one stood out a little bit. So that was one of the personal communications that I think really did seem different from some of the run-of-the-mill abuse that I think a lot of women probably experience just being on social media generally. A couple of the other instances that really come to mind have to do with, again, it had some relationship to the Trump campaign and to the election, some comments that I had made or an article that I had written or linked to. I can't even remember what the triggering event was. But apparently, based on my name, someone on Twitter had decided that I was Jewish. I'm not actually Jewish, but someone had decided that I was. And they had done what was called, sometimes it's called belling the cat. And so they put parentheses, triple parentheses around my name on Twitter. And that really unleashed this torrent of anti-Semitic abuse. And it was probably 20 or 30 of these messages coming in every minute or so. And similar to what Hadas was saying, my face was photoshopped into a gas chamber, and the person standing in front of the gas chamber was Trump in an SS uniform. So things like that. And so it was really a lot of jokes about Anne Frank that people had assumed that she was that I was a descendant of hers. Really, really complicated and convoluted conspiracy theories about the Holocaust and about Anne Frank. So that was really something, because it was such a severe kind of avalanche of anti-Semitic abuse, that was really unusual. And the only other time that it's become sort of that bad, as opposed to a few tweets or emails a day, are when I've been involved with gun rights legislation, gun control legislation, and sometimes that has really produced a slew of really violent threats and a lot of violent imagery, people with their guns teaching me about how well they can shoot and how they're going to show me how well they can shoot. And so when I end up on sites like Breitbart or NRA News, and it really gets amplified when those particular outlets have it in for you, they really have a lot of very passionate followers. And it goes from, again, being 3 or 4 irritating messages to 20, 30, 40 horrifying, detailed, violent threats against your life and wishes for you to be sexually assaulted. So that all is certainly something that is hard to get used to and hard to know how to respond to.
Ari, I'm sorry to say, I know you have a story too.
Well, in reflecting, before I tell my story, in reflecting upon these stories, it highlights how, although when it happened to me, certainly I felt victimized, and I felt bad, and I felt depressed, and I felt injured, but they pale in comparison to these stories and other stories like Dr. Jacobs as well. For me, I was a guest on a television miniseries called The Internet Ruined My Life, and it was aptly named.
Yes, exactly.
And I published a couple of articles associated around that time. But on one of those episodes, I happened to mention a group of people called Gamergate. And for those who don't know, Gamergate is a hashtag on Twitter, and it is a loose collection of mostly young men online who, although they will say that they are gathered together to support ethics in gaming journalism, they're really there to harass women off the internet and out of the gaming industry. And I'd mentioned that Gamergate is just that. And that night, I received hundreds of notifications on Twitter of comments from people, anything ranging from, of course he's a Jew, or die faggot, or things like that. And I also have a website, like many academics do, and you can send a contact. It doesn't have my email address up there, but you can send an email to me. And I received emails from people, shall we say, expanding upon the theories that they raised on Twitter, which both connected my Jewish heritage, my homosexuality, and what happened to both Jews and gays in the Holocaust. So, and that was just one night. And I recall how terrible and anxious it made me feel, even though in my heart, I felt that they couldn't find me where I was. But it just made me think about all of the other examples where people have to deal with this, not just one night because you said something on television, but you have to deal with this every day because of who you are and who you've come in contact with.
You know, these stories are so dispiriting, it makes me want to go and delete my Twitter, Facebook account, and any thread of social media connectivity. But before we talk about why the internet seems to be fertile ground for hate messages, I just want to go back to Hadas, because as a journalist, the blood and lifeblood of your work is connectivity, is sources who tell you stories, and also keeping an eye on the competition. So is Twitter not an invaluable tool for you in that way? It's complicated.
Oh, and absolutely. I mean, I explain to people that Twitter is like our, I'll go back in the day, newspapers used to subscribe to the Associated Press or Reuters or UPI International, and they would have these machines in their offices that were pretty much like automatic typewriters, and news from AP or these wires that had reporters all over the world that you wouldn't be able to afford to have would send in reports you would pay to have be part of the service. And there's famous ones like when JFK died, it would be printed up really quickly, and that's when you probably remember they'd be like reading on the news, like, and this just came over the wires, and they'd read it out. Twitter is our wires of today. Often news breaks first on Twitter. Now politicians will make their first statements on Twitter, and sometimes I even find organizations or politicians who treat that as their press releases, and I'll say, well, I didn't see the statement. They'll be like, oh, well, I posted it on Twitter. They expect you to go, and they expect that to be their record. And it's also a way for me to keep track of my competition. What are they talking about? And also because I write about the media, I follow all of the journalists. And so if I see that they're all starting to tweet about the same things, maybe about how a certain one of the deputy press secretaries is popping up more and more in their tweets, maybe I'll get a story idea and say, oh, maybe I should write about that deputy press secretary. So I'm sure if I showed my Twitter feed deck to you all, it would look maddening because it's just like columns constantly moving. But it is incredibly valuable. I talk to sources. I quoted one in a story today that I talked to over Twitter, not over email. And yeah, I use it every single day, and at the same time, I do want to have interactions with my readers, because sometimes you have very meaningful interactions with them. Even if they're being mean to you, I've noticed sometimes if I actually take the time to write back to them, if they say, you're such a liberal, you never cover any of these things, and then I send them back, be like, oh, well, actually, and here's some links of what I covered, what are you interested in? And they write back, oh, wow, I didn't realize that you had actually covered all these things, I didn't see it. And then you actually have an interaction with them. So I want to keep it open. I've kept my direct messages open. So anybody can direct message me. My email is readily available if anybody wishes to email me, and I'm going to keep it that way because I think overall the good outweighs the bad on the social media aspect of it.
And this isn't just true for reporters. I mean, Twitter might be super essential for what you do and less essential for what I do, but connectivity is essential for almost everyone. To the extent that we find jobs, we find connectivity, a social connection, we engage in commerce, like we need to be connected, which highlights the absurdity of those times when our advisors or law enforcement tell victims of online harassment to just shut off your account, just close your computer, just get off Facebook. So the absurdity of that is that we need those tools. Maybe not we don't all need Twitter, but we need to be online in order to engage in modern life in 2017. That goes from absurd to vicious or insidious when you realize that if you're the victim of online harassment and a police officer is telling you the way to stop this is to shut down your account, that puts all of the onus on the victim. It absolves the perpetrator of any responsibility and tells the victim, well, because this happened to you for no fault of your own, you now have to silence yourself and you now have to step off the internet. And that makes not just the victim's life worse, that makes all of our lives worse because we've lost that person's voice from Twitter, from Facebook, from contributing to online society.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an irony, right? Because you're suppressing speech in the wake of incredibly free speech. Marianne, I think you had an interaction with someone who had written you an email, and can you talk a little bit about what you learned and whether in retrospect you thought it was a good idea to engage rather than withhold?
Well, I mean, this is such a tricky question, right? Because everybody's situated differently when they are on the receiving end of abuse like this. And there is no one good or right answer for how anybody should react. And one of the terrible things that online abuse really does, as Ari was underscoring, is it really puts, no matter what happens going forward, it's always up to the victim to try to figure out either how to minimize the damage, to make a hard decision about whether to ignore this, whether they should try to interact with this person, whether or not they should try to spark a confrontation or to try to actually communicate. And it's so different for every person. But what's really horrible, I think, for people who become targets is that this becomes it occupies so much of their mental space. And all of us, of course, are trying to live our lives. We're trying to do our jobs. We're trying to be good to our families. And what probably none of us needs is to spend even a minute, but certainly not an hour or 3 hours every day trying to figure out, should I respond to this person who's harassing me? Should I try to ask them why they're doing this? Should I try to figure out who they are? So all of that being said, in one of these cases, in the case of the email that was sent to me that was threatening to sexually assault me and take pictures of it, I think more than anything, I was angry by it. I think I was really angry at the idea that somebody wanted to say something that vicious and hide behind this really quite serious veil of anonymity that was almost impossible to pierce, at least from a technological standpoint. And so more than anything else, I just wanted to know who this was. And what I decided to do in order to try to figure out who this was, since I was kind of at a dead end with the technology, was I tried to think of a low-tech way to figure out who it was and try to appeal to this person's sense of clearly wanting to talk. And so I wrote back. And I said, oh, you sent me an email. And I find it interesting what you're saying, and I'd like to hear more. And so it's something to that effect. And so what I got back, what my theory was that people like that who have these kind of, in some ways, prepackaged almost tirades, that I thought, this person has probably said something similar to this before. And because I've been a professor for a long time, I'm used to putting in unusual phrases that I see in my students' writing to see if they plagiarize. And so what I thought I was going to do was to take out unique phrases that he might come across, and then I'd be able to track him on some other site where he actually had to have a specific email address. And that's exactly what eventually happened. After 3 or 4 really interesting email exchanges, I was able to pick up on a couple of phrases that were unusual enough that got me to a Facebook account, which got me to his actual email address, which got me to his actual identity. So that was gratifying, I guess, in some ways.
The Nancy Drew of cyberspace.
Can I ask, did you do anything with that information once you knew?
I actually did, because I was, at the time I was in conversations with the FBI about a different matter and mentioned this to them and actually gave them the name, and they said, actually, this is someone we know about, because he was actually serving, he said something in his email about the fact that he'd spent some time in prison, and I think it was because he was carrying a loaded weapon somewhere where he wasn't supposed to. He was in Texas, but the FBI, or the federal authorities I was speaking to, said, we know him because he's been implicated in some child pornography rings. So clearly this was a person who had a lot of different issues. But I think for me that was important because it was a sense of I really didn't want to have somebody make that kind of impact in my life and have no way of being able to identify them and no way to speak back. And so I really couldn't resist then. But I have to say, I mean, if I did that with every really upsetting email that I got or offensive tweet, then I would do nothing else with my life. And I don't think I'd be a very happy person. So I've tried to limit the times that I'm going to do that. But I have to say it was somewhat gratifying to do that.
And notice how hard that is. Marianne started this process with Marianne is a high information individual generally, has experience with cyber harassment, experience typing phrases into Google to check for plagiarism. So you had these tools and you had these strategies in your mind. Imagine if anyone in the audience was trying to do this. I mean, most of us don't have the experience or the tools or even the know-how to be able to find out who is doing what to us. And that means we either give up, which is what they want, or we rely on the platforms, where these things are happening. If it's on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, we rely on them by reporting it, and not all of them ever respond. So that means that we're left to either try to do it on our own, spend 24 hours a day trying to find out who these people are, and that would not very successfully, or we rely on companies who, and some of them don't have really an interest to stop these things because they want more accounts and they don't want the publicity.
And I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that when you go to the authorities, often they can't do anything or they won't do anything, and they actually tell you, the victim, if you can find out who this person is, as Marianne did, then we can go after them. So when that's what they told me when I got some of the photos and things like that, because they were threats. We were in contact with FBI and with police, and the police did come and they took a police report, but they pretty much told us there's nothing we can do unless you find out who this person is. And I didn't want to spend the time because I didn't feel as though they were being threatening enough directly to me. I was very careful in reading everything that they were sending me to make sure that nothing in there indicated to me that they knew where I worked or they knew how to get to my home or where any of my family lived. And actually I was somebody else who had been, somebody who I had written about who had been the target, who had gotten into a confrontation with one of Trump's campaign managers, had actually given me the recommendation of try to find yourself online. She was like, try to be one of them and see if you can find out where you live, the address of your workplace. And she said, if you can find it, leave your home. Because she was getting really intense stuff, so she did actually leave her home. But I did that, and I was very lucky in that somehow at the time I was living in a rental home, so there was no property records or anything like that. And to get to where our actual newsroom is, you really have to know where you're going. It's very, they don't mark it at all, and I think there's a reason for it. If you go to the front of our building where our newsroom is located, I don't know if our names, it says anywhere that Politico is located in there. So that's why I didn't do what Marianne did. But even as a journalist, I honestly, when she was talking about how she was like, oh, I looked to see if he would repeat these certain phrases, I would have never thought about that. But because you're a professor, you were thinking about stuff like that, but I, as a journalist, was thinking of going other routes. I was like calling contacts I knew in the FBI, being like, hey, can you help me out here? And they were all like, not really.
Well, I mean, kudos to all of you for being intrepid people with intellect who can make those decisions. I'm so saddened that there's no protocol. If you're harassed at work, most companies, whether they pay attention to it or not, have policies, and you can go to HR and get the process started. There's really no equivalent in cyberspace, is there? If you're targeted, you have to sort of do your own a la carte reaction, which strikes me as imbalanced, right? There's a sort of asymmetry of power.
It's harder, certainly. Let me say that there has been a change over the last 5 to 7 years, in part because of the work that Marianne and others have been doing. Before, there was nothing. There was no, the internet may not have been a total Wild West, but it was a lot more like it. At least today, even platforms like Twitter understand that the proliferation of this stuff is not in their interest. So there is a reporting forum. Microsoft has a reporting forum on its gaming platforms. Even Pornhub has a reporting forum to stop this. Now, that is progress, but I have a friend whose daughter is who is the victim of on Instagram. Who was victim of threats to spread around sexual images of her, and this daughter is in her tweens. She's super young, and Instagram has a reporting mechanism. You can say, oh, were you a victim of blackmail? Were you a victim of fraud? Were you a victim of this? Were you a victim of that? Victim of cyberbullying? And then you click on the button, and then the forums take you to another forum, and then they take you to another forum, and they don't give you an opportunity to explain exactly what happened. You have to click on this, and click on that, click on this button, and then you have to wait for a response. And then sometimes the response comes back from a bot that says, sorry, we're not able to help you, thanks, bye. And then and then you try again, and then you try again. And all of this is left up to the individual. So while there may be reporting mechanisms, and while there may be companies are hiring safety professionals because they recognize that there's movement for this, those forums and those tools are not always effective, and they take up a lot of time in your life in order to use them.
So it's easier to cancel an Amazon order, as I did yesterday for something I was sending to my mother. I couldn't believe the speed with which Amazon said, no problem, we're not charging you. It's way easier to do that than to report what could be a life-threatening or certainly a reputation-threatening complaint. Marianne, is that because companies, not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to, are companies just not prioritizing this? Will they claim it's a free speech issue, or they just don't see a hit in their reputation or their bottom line?
Well, it's really a combination of multiple factors. I mean, one part of this has to do with the way that the internet evolved generally in the 1990s. When the internet began to be what it is, and it's almost, for those of us who are pre-internet and also now living in this whatever middle internet phase that we're in, to know what it was like to go from no internet to internet, it was really a very transformative time. And a lot of the rhetoric at the time was, the internet's going to change everything for the better, and therefore there needs to be no regulation. We had developed, obviously, in our offline societies, ways of imputing control to people. So that, as you were saying, if you were getting harassed at work, you know, after the 1970s, thanks to the work of feminist activists and others, you couldn't just say, you know, oh, I'm being sexually harassed at work, and your boss couldn't just say, well, I don't care about that, right? Something had to change, and we developed all these theories of liability that said, well, even if you're not the person directly responsible for the harassment, if you control the space, if you're the owner of that area, if you're the principal of that school, you have a responsibility, and that is what it looks like today. But the internet doesn't look like that. And in fact, it went in exactly the opposite direction, because Congress actually passed a law that said, we're precisely going to never do that. And if you have a space, an online space as opposed to an offline space, where you invite a bunch of people to come in, and those people come in and do terrible things and tear up the virtual carpet and, you know, set the place on fire, nobody's responsible. You're probably never going to be able to trace the person who actually did it, because they're going to be anonymous, and the person who's actually hosting the website has no obligations to do anything for you. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but largely speaking, they have no obligations. So I think one part of it is tech companies grew up in that kind of field where they were told you can get all the benefits of having these intermediaries and platforms and products that will line your pockets, and you have no obligations. You can be celebrated for democratizing certain areas. You can be celebrated for helping revolutionize the way that people communicate, but you're actually never going to be on the hook for the terrible things that you are going to make possible. So then you have a misalignment of incentives, and that is something that we're still grappling with today. As Ari said, in the last few years, we have seen considerable evolution on the part of companies to say we are going to take some responsibility even though we're not legally obligated to do so. They're doing that partly because their bottom line has changed. If enough users on Twitter say, we're going to all leave Twitter if you don't do something about this rampant abuse and harassment, Twitter then does have to take a serious look at itself to see whether or not it wants all those people to leave and be left with basically nothing but the abusers. So I think what's been clear, and I think a lot of the credit is due to users themselves who have communicated to these companies that they want a different product. Because these companies don't have legal obligations to us, and as the saying goes, if you're not paying for a service, if you're not paying for a product, you are the product. There's very limited things that you can say or do, but you can have some sort of power because they need you. Facebook needs you, Twitter needs you. And if you say in enough numbers and loudly enough, well then if you want us to stay on this platform, get a handle on the threats, get a handle on the revenge porn, then they will probably have to respond. But they have gone more than a decade developing spaces where they basically could do whatever they wanted, and it's very hard now to reverse engineer a solution, even if at any of these major companies you could get consensus across the people making the decisions that they want to crack down on a particular form of abuse. Trying to implement that now that you've already set up these entire systems and platforms in a way that has made it decentralized and almost impossible to control is really difficult. So I think it's true that we're seeing a real evolution in terms of how they've responded, but if we take something like non-consensual pornography or what's called doxing, so if you gather information about a person that is your target, you find out their home address, you find out their phone number, you find out where their kids go to school, and you dump all that information out there so that people will harass them. These are things that happen in real time. These are things that cannot be remedied by counter speech. You know, that's kind of our old classic conventional wisdom, is to say if there's bad speech out there, just speak back. But how do you speak back to the fact that your private nude photo has just been exposed on a revenge porn site? How do you speak back to the fact that someone has just announced where your kids go to school? So we have to recognize, I think, in those circumstances that these social media platforms have made it possible to transmit that information instantaneously, causing potential grave harm, and that there's very little that any user can do about that, and there's certainly nothing that that user can do to speak back to that. That's a design issue, that's an architectural issue, and these companies are going to have to think long and hard about how to restructure their very platforms and reshape how the internet actually works, otherwise we're just going to be stuck here.
Another side to the free speech values discussion, not just, as Marianne said absolutely correctly, that the traditional trope of more speech drowns out the bad stuff, and and we're going to protect it all, and that's how we're going to proceed. It's that this type of, it's about who this type of harassment tends to silence. And the victims of things like non-consensual pornography, victims of cyberbullying online tend to be members of marginalized groups. They tend to be women. They tend to be LGBTQ youth. They tend to be the disabled. They tend to be people whose voices are not generally recognized in face-to-face society as well as online. And as such, because they are the victims, they are the ones that are encouraged to shut their computer down, or they are the ones who are psychologically affected by this experience, we lose those voices. And it's not just losing voices. It's not just a numbers game. It's what kinds of voices are we losing. So think of think of a platform that, if anyone remembered right after our recent election, Nate Silver and other websites put up maps about what would have happened if only such and such voted? What would have happened if only women voted? Or what would have happened if only 18 to 25-year-olds voted? The election would have been quite different. Well, imagine a society where women, young people, gay people, black persons, the disabled, and Mexicans don't speak online. We lose those voices. And if we are interested in a society where, for the First Amendment and our free speech norms actually allow everyone to speak, cyber harassment is a direct affront to those values, because it leaves only the members of the majority who feel safe to act as harassers left in online society.
So what I'm hearing from the law department at the other side of this table is that regulation of speech might be okay, and I think for a lot of people it's hard to reconcile that notion with our beloved First Amendment. I'm old enough to remember when the Nazis marched in Skokie, and I guess I'm wondering if you guys still think that would be cool, or if the digital analog of that is the kind of hate speech that Hadas experienced and a lot of other Jewish journalists. So talk to me about that. How is this possible?
It's such an interesting phenomenon, I think, that the conversation we have around the First Amendment, because one of the first things you'll notice in Twitter conversations, Facebook conversations, every time Twitter goes to ban an account or to suspend somebody, the first thing that happens is people say, you're violating that person's First Amendment rights. And then suddenly there's hashtags of free so-and-so, free Milo, or let them out of jail, or whatever it is. And it's histrionic and it's kind of laughable in a way, but it's actually very serious, because it seems that there's at least a significant number of people in our society who don't actually understand what the First Amendment is or does. And it's become very popular in a way that would be encouraging if it were accurate. But because it's not, it's actually quite disturbing. And this oversimplification, this idea that the First Amendment gives you a right to have a specific access to a specific platform, which is not what the First Amendment does, that's one big part of it. But it's also this idea that the First Amendment is becoming this object of almost religious devotion, to say that, well, everything has to be done with respect to the First Amendment, because free speech is better than anything else. It's better than autonomy, it's better than privacy, it's better than dignity, it's better than kindness, it's better than all those things. Well, that's a kind of a strange fetish that we've developed, but not only is it a strange fetish in terms of the hierarchy that we're trying to say speech is up here and everything else is below, it's actually contradictory. Because as Ari is saying, the net effect of letting people say whatever they want to say is that many people are silenced. If you let threats and harassment and revenge porn all go unchecked, what happens is women stop talking. What happens is that LGBTQ stop talking. What you have is black people stop talking, right? You have all of these groups that already have disproportionately less influence in our society who are now being chilled and being told that if you speak up, if you actually actively participate in these communities, in these discussions, if you speak your mind, if you express yourself, if you trust somebody with a photo, you will be punished in ways that will ruin your life. If we ask ourselves whether or not that is a free speech protective world, I think the answer has got to be no. Unfortunately, however, we seem to think that free speech means something like that. People who want to shout the loudest and hurt the most people, that they somehow have the kind of priority here, and that everybody else who's going quiet and going dark simply don't matter. But it's not even just the targets themselves that are going quiet, it's everybody who's watching everything that happens. And those of us who've ever watched somebody being harassed on the street know what that's like, that it makes you scared to talk. It makes you worried about them turning their attention to you. And if that is what we're using now, the First Amendment as this kind of bludgeon, right, to say you have to be quiet and you have to be silenced because I want to say the terrible, hurtful, threatening, damaging thing I want to say, what do we think the First Amendment was supposed to be protecting? Is it really creating a society where we are more free to express ourselves? Is it creating a society where we're a more informed individual? Is it creating a society where we are more autonomous and that we're making better democratic decisions? If the answers to those questions are no, then I think we have to really rethink what it is that we mean by and should mean by the First Amendment.
So taking your question, and if I may broaden it a little bit, it's not just about a question about whether the online analog of Nazis marching in Skokie should be allowed is really a question about line drawing. We recognize that mean people are everywhere. You know, you trade some mean people for another when you move towns. There are mean people everywhere, and they're going to say mean things. And no one is suggesting that any type of regulation of online platforms would enforce any type of civility code like we enforce for our children. But there is a qualitative difference between just being mean to one another or saying stupid and nasty things and targeted identity-based harassment or targeted threats like I am going to rape and kill you. Obviously, the tougher questions are in the middle. So sometimes when we make arguments that there need to be reasonable regulations of free speech values, recognizing that the First Amendment doesn't apply to platforms like Twitter, people come back and say, well, where are you going to draw the line? How can you distinguish, once you start restricting one type of speech, then we're on the path to restricting all types of speech? And as I tell my students, I don't believe in slippery slope arguments. Those are easy. Those are, that's lazy thinking. Because lawyers and the law, that is what we do. We draw lines. And sometimes we do it on a case-by-case basis, like lawsuit to lawsuit. Sometimes we do it by statute, and sometimes we do it by norm. And of course, there are going to be cases in the middle that are going to rub people the wrong way, and that there are going to be close calls. But to suggest that we can't make any rule just because one rule is hard it suggests that lawyers can't do their work and legislatures can't do their work. So specifically to the Nazis marching in Skokie, what was that story about? So for those who don't remember, you had a neo-Nazi group set up a march specifically in a town populated by a lot of Holocaust survivors in order to target them. And the Supreme Court, in order to gain maximum harm or maximum benefit to them, I guess. And the court, various courts allowed that march to go forward because free speech. However, when you, just like Marianne said, if we are a society that allows people the freedom to shop around and find the most effective way to inflict harm on a specific group or specific other person, is that really what the First Amendment was meant to protect? Is that really what free speech means? Or does free speech mean, as countless scholars and writers have said for centuries, back to Immanuel Kant, all the way to the framers of our Constitution, all the way to Justice Brandeis on the Supreme Court, that free speech in the First Amendment is really meant to ensure an informed, active citizenry of all, and where everyone can participate. Then we start to see that a First Amendment that protects targeted, identity-based harassment in order to inflict maximum type of harm is not what the First Amendment was meant to protect.
I want to drive this conversation back to the front lines of the First Amendment where Hadas lives and works, because these distinctions, which make a lot of sense to me in the academy, are harder to adhere to, particularly now where there's a swirl of news, fake news, crazy tweets, I'm not going to single anyone out, alternative explanations, and we can hear law professors talk about cabining free speech, but you're obligated, aren't you, to kind of lay it all out for readers, or how can you even, just in your day-to-day work?
Yeah, and I mean, maybe I would be one of the lazy students who says that it is a slippery slope. A lot of people have been surprised to hear me when I say that I always lean towards the side of the free speech, where I do believe that there should be a line drawn, obviously, between direct threats. Like, I think what was sent to me is easily considered a direct threat and direct call for harm, and that it should be much easier for me. I shouldn't have to trace that. The police should have the tools to be able to go to Twitter and say, give me the IP address of where this account came from, or go to an email service provider and say, give me the IP address of where this came from. This is a direct threat. However, you know, when people tweet things at me about how I'm a Jew who controls the media, and all the Jews control all the media and how horrible that is, I think it's pretty clearly on the side of free speech, even if it might not be true or if I might not agree with it. Because especially now, dealing with an administration that, for example, calls us fake news and blocks us out of news conferences sometimes. One time that happened, but also banned my newspaper from campaign events for a significant portion of the campaign because they thought that our reporting and what some of our reporters had like posted on social media was offensive to them, and they thought it crossed the line towards being biased or towards being offensive about their supporters and things like that. And I can see how it could go the other way if you draw the lines in certain ways. And so it's hard. I mean, it's really hard to reconcile the two of them, both the free speech and allowing people to say what they want with also keeping it from harming people. I do see the changes in the social media sites, even just in the last few weeks when what happened to me first happened. That was just in October. It took quite a long time for them to take the account down, and it was an account created just to harass me. Like, the entire feed and the picture was like all me. And then they kept posting more new accounts. They kept taking them down. And then just last week, I reported somebody on Twitter, and within 45 minutes, I got a response saying, we've locked this account, we've reviewed it. However, the person, once they adhered to whatever Twitter wanted them to do, was able to reopen their account. And so it's both an improvement and not improvement. Twitter, actually, there was talk of them being bought recently a few months ago, and that sale fell through. Nothing ever happened. And part of the reason that was cited, I think it was Disney was thinking of buying them. Part of the reason that was cited was concerns over their seemingly inability to control the abuse and harassment because they allow anonymous accounts. And because you can create multiple accounts that sometimes can be controlled by a software system that can automatically send out certain tweets to certain types of people or automatically respond to certain people the moment that they tweet something. And so I think that there are changes happening, and I do agree that a lot of people think that these social media platforms are public rights that they should have and should be, and they, it's free speech. It harms their free speech by being able to post to them. But there is actually a movement to make certain parts of the internet be public utilities, which you guys could probably speak much better to than I can. But from what I understand, they want them to be public utilities similar to the way your telephone line is considered a public utility, and that would, in a way, give the government a little bit more ability to control what happens there.
Regulated platform then, right?
Right. So and when you have a regulated platform, perhaps mildly so. Like we're not. There are multiple proposals along the way from nothing to becoming a public utility, but that doesn't only provide coercive requirements like you have to do X, but it also has an expressive effect. It tells us what these rules provide people with an indication of what is and what is not appropriate even outside the law. And that includes design, for example. So Hadas mentioned that one of the reasons why the sale might not have gone through is because Twitter allows anonymous accounts. So there are lots of platforms that have designed in tools, designed in elements that require real name registration, or require you to use an email address that can be verified, et cetera, et cetera. And we have actually evidence, and research that I am doing right now, we have evidence of the effect of those kind of things on safety. So for example, Tinder is a, for those who are not online dating. Tinder is an app, is a mobile app that allows you to meet other people in your nearby space. They're geolocation applications. Tinder is one example that you can log on to Tinder only through your Facebook account, which means that you have to be verified, and it uses the main picture that you have on your Facebook account. And there are other platforms on the range of geolocation dating apps that provide for more anonymity or don't require any verification and allow you to put up whatever photo you want. And then when you compare, obviously it's hard to control for all factors, but when you compare the types of harm that happens on these platforms, real name registration, or at least connection to some verified account, tends to create the norm among the platform that X, Y, and Z are not permitted. Cyber harassment, sharing naked photos, in addition to a website acting against those accounts that do violate these rules. And on the other end of the spectrum, platforms that don't go after accounts that violate their rules, platforms that permit all sorts of anonymous interaction, tend to have more examples of this harassing content. So as a result, that gives us the tool, that gives us evidence to suggest, well, these are some of the steps that have worked in the past. They might not necessarily work for your particular platform, but here are some examples, and all of those are associated with some form of control and exercising control over the wild west of what otherwise could be a wild west of a platform.
Although what I'm hearing here is almost a commercial difference. Twitter, for example, could decide tomorrow, I presume, to become a more enclosed space with more rules of the road, but they're not obligated to, and we can live by their rules or just get off, right? So what role should government play in delineating? I mean, if a company's too powerful to avoid, if you're a reporter or in the academy, should it play by stricter rules?
I think the government definitely has a role to play. When we talk about privacy in general, for example, we also have similarly lax rules in the ways that companies are responsible to us to protect our data. You know, all they have to do is just throw up a privacy policy or throw up a terms of service, and then their obligations are essentially done. And I don't know how many people in this room have actually read any one of those privacy policies or even know where they are on a website. And part of the reason why that is the limit of their obligations is because the government hasn't stepped in, except for some minimal obligations or except for additional steps that now former Attorney General in California, Kamala Harris, has taken to protect California residents and others. There are minimal obligations. Once the law starts taking a step in that direction to requiring greater responsibility, almost to make these websites be responsible to us because they are collectors of our data and collectors of our information and the host to our social and commercial lives, once the government starts making steps in that direction, then we notice that not only is there going to be some small effect that actually complies with those rules, but then there's also a greater effect because now the companies realize, well, we're going to have to start to comply with these rules. Let's start to make this an area of priority for our website. Right now, because the government is not involved, no one makes it a priority unless people like Marianne force them to.
Which I love to do.
Yeah.
But I think if you think about how one of the strongest arguments in favor of this free speech protective idea is that we don't want the government to make decisions for us about what is and isn't acceptable, that we don't want the government to censor us. And that seems right. I mean, that's an important part of our self-conception as a democracy. But if we think about now, if we ask ourselves right now whether we think we are more affected by the actual law at any level, or if we're actually more affected by the way that, for instance, social media tends to operate, which one defines our interactions more? Which one are we more concerned about? When we make decisions about how to behave or what to do or what to share or what not to share, how much are we actually thinking about, well, I need to go look up the code of regulations in my particular locality, or am I thinking about, well, what is acceptable to do on Twitter? If that's the case, in other words, what I'm suggesting is that we are subjected to informal laws and regulations all the time, apart from what the government is and isn't controlling, well then are we really much more reassured that Google is the one making those choices for us, or that Twitter is making that choice for us? If our concern or healthy skepticism about power is that we're worried about people making decisions behind our backs in closed rooms, we're worried about the way that they're shaping all of us and kind of playing us as puppets, really which one has more influence over us on a daily basis? Is it necessarily the government, or is it in fact to some extent Google has much more influence over us, or does Apple have more influence over us? And if that's the case, where's their transparency, where there's accountability? We don't get to elect them, we don't get to eject them, right? So it's all very well and good for us to be skeptical about power structures, but sometimes we're not paying attention to those power structures that really are shaping us. And it's harder to know once we're not talking about the government, and the government always gets a bad rap for being the government, but at least in theory there is accountability there. It's supposed to be premised on the idea of accountability, and that if you don't like something that you can vote it out. Now that's obviously a theoretical, more than real kind of hope, but there is at least that structure in place. And so when we talk about the First Amendment, what often happens is we become incredibly and oddly legalistic about what's really at stake. We're not thinking about the fact that the way that we have decided to interact with these platforms is already censoring us, right? If you think about Twitter, Twitter censors everything that you say over 140 characters. But people don't call it censorship because it's just how the platform operates. But it's so strange that the moment that Twitter does something you don't like or that you're not accustomed to, you call that censorship. It's very odd. And so one of the things that's vitally important in this conversation is to think about all the different ways in which we actually make our decisions about what to say, what not to say, how to communicate with each other. Who is it that's actually shaping for us the ideas of what's acceptable and what's not? Who is it that actually has the power to change some of these attitudes and some of these beliefs? Is it always the government? Is it maybe some of the social media companies? Is it a combination of the two? But when we think about how much technology, just to speak incredibly broadly, has done for us, why is it that we don't think of it like anything else in the world? Like a great product that has just been released but maybe kills 6 out of 10 people who use it, right? Why do we assume that just because something does have positive benefits that we don't need to do a quite careful cost-benefit analysis, for lack of a better term, to see whether or not we need to handle this product a little bit more and regulate it? If we know that we're selling people jewelry that catches on fire, then maybe we should fix the fire problem. Or if there's a factory that's giving us wonderful jobs and actually bringing lots of innovation to a community but is polluting the rivers, that's an issue. We should care about that as well. But what we've done, I think, instead, is we've ended up with this internet exceptionalism, where everything that happens online is both real and not real. And therefore, we take all the good things that it gives us and we basically throw up our hands and say we can't do anything about the bad. But of course, that can't be right, because that's not how we treat anything in our society, and it shouldn't be how we treat anything in our society.
Probably somebody who works in news, there was a lot of attention over fake news over the election and how that affected the election. And I think what's going to be one of the biggest next things we do is transparency into, for example, how Facebook decides its algorithm, because they have a lot more control over what you see, which can actually directly affect. There have been studies that actually show even how it can affect people to get out and vote, how it can affect people to feel about certain things, and transparency into how that works is, I think, going to be one of the next big internet battles between both Facebook and Google, because we're seeing that it does directly affect how our society works in the same way that there have been battles over like monopolies over telecom companies and things like that. Hi.
Hello.
So we're going to move to the question and answer period. And while you're all thinking about the questions you want to ask, and we have the person with the mic moving around to find the people asking questions, I just wanted to say that we here at the JCC are extremely proud of this series, not because of only because of the intellectual content, like what you've heard tonight around compelling issues, but also on that note, there are a series of unintended consequences that have come about as a result of prior panels. So we're pleased to tell you that the conversation we had and the impact of our programs really continue beyond this JCC living room. I'll give you 2 examples. Our partners at WGBH report a very high level of traffic on the website, especially after our discussion on gender. Secondly, we were really encouraged to hear that after we brought the new voices, perspectives from Israeli and Palestinian young adults, there was a donor who attended the program and took action and arranged to have an Israeli friend in business help 2 of the Palestinian individuals who were talking about the difficulty they had finding jobs, took them to this Israeli businessman, and there's been a relationship developed there. So we look forward to the unintended consequences in addition to the very meaningful discussion. So with that, questions? I can't see anybody, but there's a woman right here, yes.
I'd like to thank you all for sharing your stories and for being here. My questions are primarily for Professor Franks and Professor Waldman. What form specifically do you think government regulation should take in this area to increase the ability of plaintiffs in cases to unmask their harassers? Because it seems to me that if there were, I mean, if you take the self-regulatory possibility off the table and you consider the challenge that people have in bringing claims when, you know, as we've said, there's really no way to unmask the people who are talking to them, wouldn't, do you think, harassers be less likely to say harmful things if they knew that their identities could be disclosed? So, short of a subpoena, what do you think the government should be doing in this area?
Are you in law school? Are you a lawyer?
But that's so sweet of you to think I'm that young.
Oh, sure, hand off to me. I don't know if there's a good answer to that question, because certainly in the work that I do and that I know that Ari does, one of the things that we are confronted with and that we're constantly frustrated by is the fact that, yes, it's the anonymity in many cases, that it's frustrating because you can't even start a case, you can't really start an investigation if you have no idea who the person is, and law enforcement won't help me because they won't know either. That's incredibly frustrating, and it's something that I do think shapes a lot of, or actually incentivizes a lot of the behavior that we're seeing, because a lot of people who would not otherwise act in this manner, right, they feel as though they can act in this way because they feel like they will never be caught. That being said, plenty of people act this way under their own names. And in addition to that, anonymity has many powerful benefits, right? So the hard thing about law, right, about creating these lines and these rules is that we have to think about how they would be abused, and we have to think about all the benefits that would go away if we were to take away some power. If we were to take away, if we were to give the government more tools to unmask people, we can often think about what that would mean for political dissent, right? We could think about what that would mean for domestic violence victims who are struggling to find a way to rebuild their lives and to try to find ways to avoid detection. We could think that there's plenty of people who have good reasons to hide their identity, that we would not want to make it easier for the government to be able to have a hand in unmasking them. So that would be such a delicate thing to deal with. If we weren't just talking about putting the power in the hands of the government, we could make some value judgments, because that's what we're supposed to do, right? Make value judgments about the fact that so long as you are using anonymity because you are in a subordinated position and you need to speak to someone who is in a greater position, that is, you have relatively less power and it's a way of trying to protect yourself, we could say that's a good value. We could say then, but if you're using anonymity to torment somebody else or to hide from your own the negative consequences of your behavior, that's a negative value. Because there's no reason for us to say, well, we can only take anonymity as a full-on concept, we can't add any types of characteristics to it. I don't know how we would legislate that. I think it's a really tricky thing to legislate, but I don't know why it is the case that private companies can't do more on this. Why can't private companies that are making decisions for us all the time, the algorithms are telling us what we want to know, they're telling us the kinds of things that we should be looking for in the first 10 search results, they can also make decisions about whether or not they will turn over information about people misusing their platforms or not. So I guess I'd be more comfortable saying, given the fact that so much of this power and this expertise is in the hands of these private companies, those private companies maybe should be making substantive value judgments here that would help. And I'm not sure how we would do it if we were really going to give the government that kind of power.
But I think, I agree with everything Marianne said, but I think there is a role for law to play. And that's why I love this question so much. And your knowledge of it suggests that you're a lawyer or in law school, which is great. But one of the problems is that while we can absolutely make a judgment that says when this context occurs, when you're using anonymity as a shield to protect yourself from the responsibility that you should have from directly attacking someone else, a unique, constrained area, Even in that unique area, when people do try to unmask their harassers, you go from one jurisdiction to the next in this country and you have a totally different standard. In one area, you have to essentially prove your entire case such that there is not a single doubt that you would win before you can even unmask your alleged harasser. In other places, all you have to do is allege facts enough to write a lawsuit and say that you tried to figure out who this person was, and that was not enough. So you can go from one jurisdiction to the next and have totally different standards. And as Marianne noted, on the one hand, if you go too far, if you make it too hard, these people are never going to, no victim is ever going to find redress, and harassers are going to act with impunity. If you go too low, then we're going to unmask people left and right. So in looking at these standards, and I actually have my students every year in privacy engage in this, in my privacy class, engage in this activity. Look at all these standards that we have, and considering the positives, considering what we want to do, and also considering the negatives, as Marianne said, the potential negative externalities that could happen if you have too low or too high standard, find me the good one. What would be the best standard? So this isn't a law that a state necessarily passes. This is something that courts would develop, kind of like we call it common law, over time, developing a standard for unmasking. And somewhere in the middle, in this idea that you, what lawyers call, develop a prima facie case. You allege sufficient facts such that you have a full lawsuit together. You haven't proven anything beyond a reasonable doubt, but you have a full lawsuit set up together, and that you've engaged in all reasonable efforts to find out who this person is. That would take out frivolous cases, and it would still allow for redress. Now, of course, there are going to be tough calls in the middle, but that doesn't mean we should try. So I think Marianne is absolutely right that there is no reason why platforms can't make decisions about when being more capable of handing over information in certain contexts. I think if we had a better, more uniform standard, we would create the norm that law says we're going to unmask you when you do something wrong.
Lauren, do we have another question?
We have our next question right here.
Thank you. I start with a comment that I agree that in my day-to-day life, Google or Facebook or Twitter or whatever has a more significant impact than the city of Newton, the state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the country of the United States. However, I can step away from Facebook tomorrow. I can step away from Twitter tomorrow. I could move out of Newton. I could move out of Massachusetts. I could theoretically move out of the United States, but those are each far more difficult to step away from. And so a rule or regulation from one of those entities can have a much more lasting and direct impact. In terms of regulation, I, perhaps like the last questioner, actually am an attorney. And one of the things I learned in constitutional law is that governments are singularly bad at regulating speech. And I think we can look at the past and present administrations for how different those rules would be and why it could be scary why any one of them might have the ability to somehow limit speech. For example, the last president was a constitutional law professor, so he probably wouldn't try to regulate speech, but if he did, he would draw very different lines from the current president, who clearly was not a constitutional law scholar. And I don't think I would necessarily want either of them drawing those lines. So how do you have a government draw lines about speech? Aren't you concerned that those lines will end up swaying one way or another based upon who happens to be in office?
They do. They do all the time. And all of us are living in a world right now where somebody's made those decisions. We tend to think, and it's often a stereotype, I think, of the First Amendment to say, well, basically, we all have a neutral position with regard to speech, and everything's basically out there. But that's never been true. There's never been a point in American history where the government has said all speech is basically up for grabs. Never. We've always had historical prohibitions on certain forms of speech. And it's not just the obvious stuff, right? Child pornography, obscenity, defamation, fighting words. It's not just those categories. It's also, if you think about, for instance, prohibitions against criminal conspiracy, right? If I call somebody up and I use my words to say, I want to hire you to kill my husband, not okay with the law, right? There are regulations about that. Basically everything in securities regulation is a prohibition on speech. Basically, every time we say that you can't commit perjury, we're infringing upon your speech. Every time we tell your doctor that he or she cannot release your medical records, we're infringing upon their speech. There are all kinds of ways in which we are prohibiting speech all the time. So the first thing I think we have to recognize is not to say, aren't we scared about what governments are going to do if we give them this power? They've always had this power. The government has the power to do lots of things to us, and we can contest whether or not those are good or bad things. We should always contest that, but that's nothing new. And the illusion I think that many of us have is that somehow we've lived in this kind of state of Eden with freedom of speech, and that anything we do from here on out is going to take us out of Eden. But we were never in Eden, there was never a paradise. So I think it's right to say that we should be skeptical. We always need to be really skeptical about the government's power to control us, because the government does have the power to take away our liberty in ways that are not comparable really to any other actors. But I think it is worth pushing back on this idea that you could just stop using Facebook or just stop using Google. You can stop using those products. They don't stop using you. I think it's something that everybody should understand, right? If you've been doxxed on Twitter and you decide, well, I'm going to shut down my Twitter account, tell that to the 20 people who are going to show up on your doorstep trying to hurt you because of whatever it is that the information that was put out about you. So I think, especially when we say things like, well, I'm much more scared of the government than I would be of what could happen on Twitter, I think that probably reveals something about who we are in society. Ask a domestic violence victim who she's more scared of, the government or her ex coming to find her. I think it's pretty clear that what kind of answer we're going to get. Ask somebody who's living in a highly racist town that's worried every time he steps out of his doorstep that he might get attacked, who he's really worried about. Is it the government? No. Which isn't to say that we shouldn't worry about the government. What I'm really saying is worry about everything. But we have a tendency to be on our guard with the government when we tend to drop our guards with everything else. And so what I guess I'm suggesting is that we not be selective about our skepticism.
I wanted to just, before you ask your question, I want to ask Hadas a question, because I really wondered about this. You've all talked about horrible experiences, but I really followed yours with the bullet and all the other pictures. And the way I followed it was not because I saw it originally where it took place, but because I saw it reported elsewhere. And I'm just curious as to what you think about how the follow-up to that horrible experience, whether that helped or hurt.
Yeah, this was something that I had a lot of discussions about with my news organization because the way it was initially shared was not super publicly. I did share it on Facebook, and my Facebook is delineated where I choose what only my friends will see and what my public Facebook will be, which is where I post my stories. So I posted it to my friends, and one of my friends, who is also a journalist, posted it to her Twitter, which is very public, and she has tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of followers, and that's where it all got picked up. So I wasn't actually publicizing it myself. And I got tons of offers to do TV, to do every TV station you could think of. I got calls for interviews from every major newspaper, and especially in Israel, a lot in Israel. And I did a couple of interviews. I did absolutely no television about it, because the last thing I wanted was a real picture of me next to the picture that everybody saw. And I was of two minds of it. On the one hand, sure, I thought that it was important for people to know that this happens, but I also sort of knew, and we were discussing this at dinner before, that sometimes I do think we're talking to ourselves. We're preaching to the choir. And the people who would potentially actually be affected by this weren't going to be reading the New Yorker or the New York Times or Tablet or Forward where any of this appeared. And the people who would be reading about it and horrified about it would have probably already knew that it was happening. And also, I just honestly, like, as a journalist, I don't like to be the story. I want to be the one writing the story. So I did participate in a few interviews, but I strictly kept it to written interviews. I did not do any sort of audio or television, except in Israel, because I speak Hebrew, and so I knew it was going to be in Hebrew, and probably the trolls don't speak Hebrew, and so they wouldn't be able to listen to it and understand it. And also because there was, in a way, I thought that the people in Israel were getting really, really concerned about it, and they wanted to hear that, like, I was still functioning, and that they wanted to understand that while this was happening online, it's not like people were stopping me on the street in any way. And I'm still kind of go back and forth, even of doing panels like this, because I don't know if I necessarily want to attract more attention to it, but I do think it's an important thing to talk about. I especially like this panel because there's talk about the law and what's actually can be done, or anything be done about it, and there's like an intellectual discussion about free speech. But it's a weird experience to be in the news. And I to this day don't have the answer of whether the way I handled it is any better than my good friend Julia Yaffe, who was of the opposite mind, who said, no, I need to accept every television offer that I get. I'm going to get this out there. I'm going to show everybody what it is. And ironically, she was the one who actually originally shared my photo. And we were just of two different minds of it, but she was very obviously respectful of the way I chose to handle it. And maybe for me, it was also just more of a privacy thing. I mean, what Julia went through was much worse than what I went through, because she did get doxxed, and she got phone calls from, for example, funeral homes who said, hey, we got a call saying that you were going to need our services today. So can you imagine getting that phone call being like, we're preparing your casket for you? And I didn't deal with it. And I think part of the reason I didn't get things that far was because I maybe silenced myself by only speaking out in written word or not going on television. But I think people are right to do both versions, and I think it's just up to the personal person and how they want to deal with it.
I think so
I could talk to you for hours, but very briefly, I've been a victim of cyberbullying and harassment for as long as the internet's existed. When I first wrote a blog on the Huffington Post in December of 2015 titled Trump, ISIS's Greatest Collaborator, I had 200 hateful comments within an hour, and they were all attacking me. I never felt so unsafe in all of the years of my career as someone speaking out about cults and brainwashing. But I want to put something out to hear what you have to say about the knowledge that we have now of people like Mercer who are gathering information, profiles through Facebook and other online things, and our increased knowledge about social psychology and covert hypnotic techniques and undue influence techniques, such as ISIS is using to recruit on the internet, and the lack of education. Like, nobody wants to talk about mind control or techniques of manipulation. So I just want to hear what you might say to me to help protect me in the future as I'm getting disinformation campaign after Scientology was the most recent one. Any thoughts also about the future with technology and this interface, which is really scary?
Well, I'll take this one. I'll try. There's a lot there, and I think it's part of a broader discussion as to how we design new technologies. It's not just about safety, it's about protecting our information, protecting our privacy, and the ways in which these platforms relate to us. So there are lots of platforms that exist today that are designed with profit in mind and not us, and not our safety in mind, or not our privacy in mind. And there is an entire agenda among lawyers, among policymakers, among privacy professionals to encourage companies to not design platforms that don't care about profit, but design platforms that do care about privacy and do care about safety. I have a colleague who I consult with quite a bit at Microsoft, and she is their head of safety. She has a department, she works on protecting Microsoft's platforms and protecting individuals who use them. And she and I often talk about, well, what about this strategy? What about requiring real name registration? What about turning off comments? What about being more active? What about hiring a team of people instead of having just 5 people that monitor the gaming platform? What about, do we need to hire 50? Do we need to hire 100? And how do we protect them from having PTSD from all the really terrible stuff that they read? Do we shut off comments? Do we design games that have no comment section and just interaction on the VR or interaction on the UI, the user interface? So these are all design strategies, which means that who's going to be involved in those decisions that are going to protect you and going to protect everyone else? Well, there are going to be people like Jacqueline who are making those policies, my friend at Microsoft, who make those recommendations to the company. But really, it's the technologists, it's the engineers, it's the computer scientists, the people that design these algorithms that take in all your information and pop out information about you, and then censor what you see, just like Marianne said, tailor the ads you see, tailor the feed that you see, tailor the pictures that you see based on what they think you like. So it's them, it's the designers, it's the technologists that we have to educate and remind them that they're not just designing an algorithm that answers a problem. They're not just facing a threat model. They are instead designing tools for us to use and us to engage in socially. And the research that I have done suggests that when you talk to these people about who are extraordinarily well educated and extraordinarily talented at what they do, when you start asking them about things like privacy and safety, they shut down. They say, that's not my job. I don't know anything about that. Leave that to someone else. What we have to do in order to protect us in the future is we have to start making sure that our technologists and our designers are coming into their jobs recognizing that privacy and safety is part of the code that they need to write.
I would agree with all that, and I would also add, though, that one of the things that's going to help ensure that is that the right people need to be in the room. If we're going to have, and we know that the tech industry is heavily dominated by white men, that's just a fact, that you're only going to get certain types of design solutions, certain things are going to be on the radar because you won't have the people in the room who could really flag certain issues and say, you know what, this live streaming service that you think is such a great idea, what about when it's going to be used to live stream a gang rape, right? When Facebook says after the fact, well, we never thought that it could be used that way, well, how is that possible that you didn't think it could be used that way? So the big piece of it is going to be actually getting some diversity in the tech industry. But the other piece of this, I think, that I want to say something about is at the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which is the nonprofit that I work for, we're launching a new project actually on the question of how to train ourselves against propaganda, to train ourselves against fake news. So, yeah, thank you. We have one fan. But what we're trying to do is this idea that we need to be developing critical skills of media literacy and basically scientific literacy as well, because we have to figure out a way to make people less vulnerable to propaganda. It can't just be that we keep responding to each case-by-case basis. Oh, a terrible thing happened here. How do we stop that? Fake news is out of control. It has to be that we are developing and equipping ourselves with the right types of skills to be able to handle that we want to teach people to be able to evaluate better and worse sources of evidence, stronger and weaker claims, things that are illusory from things that actually have empirical basis. And so what we're trying to think about right now is to collaborate with tech industry and to collaborate with universities to try to think of programs to actually introduce the general public about educating us so that we're all at least at a certain basic level of media literacy, and to look at examples of people who have turned away. For those of you who haven't heard of Megan Phelps-Roper and her story, there was a profile done of her in the New Yorker by Adrienne Chen. I recommend reading it. She was one of the members of the Westboro Baptist Church, which is notorious for showing up at soldiers' funerals and other types of events to promote their virulently anti-homosexual, anti-military, anti-everything. She was part of that church, and through conversations on Twitter, moved away from the church and has basically become an advocate against online harassment. And her story is extraordinary. And I think we need to look at those stories, and we need to figure out how it is that people get de-radicalized. We need to be looking at how it is that people are able to break away and try to form that into an educational basis that we can share with as many people as possible.
Next question, here in the front.
Yeah, thank you very much for your experiences and for having the, for lack of a better term, the guts to come out and say what has happened to you. Now, I've been cyberbullied myself, and I don't really care, because the first thing that pops into my mind is, this is a coward. Because if you can't say something straight to my face, then why are you bothering me with this garbage? So the first thing to understand is these people are not brave in any way, shape, or form. They're just there to harass people because they are cowards. And I think once people understand that, they just brush them off. I did find the guy who was harassing me, and only because of something that only he would have known, because I originally came from New York, and in a conversation back and forth with him where I just stayed very mellow, he just happened to mention something that had happened some 40 years ago. And then I just, I just looked him up I just did a Google search, looked him up, and he told me he was from Utah this week. You know, I'm from Utah, I'm gonna come and beat you up and this, that, and the other thing. Turns out he lived a town away. So I just went to his house, knocked on the door, and I said, you know who I am? And he goes, no. I said, well, you must, because you look at my Facebook all the time. I said, I'm Bob Funk. What, you got something you want to say to me?
Excuse me, we do need a question.
So how, other than having the government do this, is there a way to deal with this? Other than just
Thank you very much.
hitting these people where it hurts?
Well, keep in mind that not many victims of cyber harassment are as strong as you might be. Imagine you are a young, whether you're a young woman, an adolescent, queer individual, a queer student, a disabled person in school, an adult. We don't all have the wherewithal or the sense of self or the strength to be able to just say, this is a lunatic, I'll be fine, I'm just going to go about my life. As a result of that, and I don't really recommend that the victims that I speak to go find and go up to the homes of their harassers. That is a recipe for disaster for most of us. While I don't recommend that, there's a point at which these words are creating severe psychological harm. And when in other areas of our lives people cause us severe psychological and potentially physical harm, we regulate that and we punish it. We punish it criminally and we punish it civilly. There is absolutely no reason why those same principles that have allowed us to punish in all different forms offline harassment, words as well as deeds, should not apply to the internet.
I think we have time for one more question if we have one out there. Lauren is doing her best to get all over this place.
Recognizing there's a completely different constitutional and common law background, can we find any guidance in how other countries, particularly in the EU, are dealing with social media companies in regards to privacy issues?
They're causing them a lot of headaches. So some of you have probably heard the concept of the right to be forgotten from Europe, and this is something that tech companies, interestingly enough, it was part of their resistance to hearing about complaints in the United States because they were worried about potential right to be forgotten-like claims. So when we first started talking to Google and Facebook and others about non-consensual pornography and about the possibility of regulating this, one of the informal responses we got was, well, if we go down that road, slippery slope, and it's going to mean that people are going to take it, they're going to be asking to not only for nude pictures to be taken down, but unflattering photos, and they're going to be wanting us to take down just bad stories about them, things that make them not look very good. Politicians are now going to say, hey, that thing I did just last week, let's pretend like I didn't do that. It's hard for us to imagine, but imagine. So if we're worried about that, then this is, and that's a real concern, right? What is it we can do about those types of issues? And Europe, I think, though, is an interesting example because when we say things like we need to have the First Amendment needs to operate this way, we forget that we have natural experiments, non-First Amendment based, around us all the time. And so we can look to France, we can look to Germany, we can look to the United Kingdom, and we can ask ourselves, do we think that they're getting it, you know, no one's getting it right, but are they getting it better than us, right? Defamation works differently in other countries. Libel works differently. Pornography works differently. Lots of different things work differently, maybe sometimes better, maybe sometimes worse. But it may very well be time for us to say that we shouldn't assume that the United States has got the best version because things aren't working out so well for us. And there are plenty of empirical studies that actually do try to take objective measures to figure out how progressive is the society, how democratic are they, how well educated are they. And the United States does not do well when it comes to those particular measures. So maybe now really is the time to say, let's look at the countries that are doing well, take a look at some of the policies that Germany, for instance, has in place, and try to see if that might not be a better way to go about it. So I think it's exactly right to say we need to stop assuming that we've got the very best version of all possible worlds right now, that there are lots of other natural experiments around us and we should probably learn from them.
Here's a specific example if we have time. Here's a specific example. So I just finished writing a paper. Not sure if any law review has accepted it yet, but just finished writing a paper about cross-state differences in incidence or rates of bullying, cyberbullying, and suicidal ideations among lesbian, gay, and bisexual teenagers. There was this great survey run by the CDC, which is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which for the first time in 2015 asked questions about, well, they've always asked questions about bullying, cyberbullying, and suicidal thoughts, but for the first time in 2015, they separated out results between heterosexual students and LGB students. And I wanted to ask, well, is there any effect of having an anti-bullying statute, comprehensive or not, on these rates of bullying? And you find, actually, no, very little. The real difference, and one of the reasons why we actually see lower rates of LGB bullying in schools in England and in France, which are the only two countries in which I had available data, is because the major factor, the statistically significant factor that is associated with lower rates of bullying, cyberbullying, and suicidal ideation among LGB students is a general commitment of equality in the country or in the state. So rates of bullying in Massachusetts, rates of bullying among LGBT community in Massachusetts are lower than they are in Oklahoma. Not because Massachusetts's anti-bullying statute is any better, or not because the statute that you guys passed in 2007 or 2010 is any better than Oklahoma's, because according to the Department of Education, both laws meet about 80–85% of the DOE's recommendations of what should be in an anti-bullying law. But it's because Massachusetts, through employment protections, through transgender protections, through other forms of other laws that protect the LGBTQ community, has shown a greater commitment to equality, and therefore has created norms in schools and created the expectation that this is how we treat young kids. It's also why we see lower rates of cyberbullying and bullying among LGBT students in countries that also have a greater commitment to equality than the United States has. And you need only look to states like Arkansas. Arkansas has a really great anti-bullying law. It has enumerated characteristics, it has met all of the DOE's requirements, but its bullying rates are just slightly lower than Oklahoma's, which is at 50% among, as self-reported LGBT students. So it's not the law. It's not this one law. It's a general commitment to equality. So if we're looking for a way that the law can get involved in protecting vulnerable youth, this study was only about LGB students, but if we're looking for a way that the law can get involved, start generally protecting people. Start passing laws that guarantee equal protection, equal wages for women. Passing laws that guarantee that transgender persons can use the bathroom that they feel that accommodates to their gender expression. That is how we protect people. That means that equality is real. An equality agenda is really a public safety agenda, because that's the only way that we're actually going to protect these vulnerable students and vulnerable youth from the kind of harassment that's out there.
I wanted to give Lisa just the last word to see if you had anything to sort of sum this up with, because you sat here very patiently during the question and answer.
Well, I learned from YouTube that the moderator's job is to sort of stub in for the audience and then let the stars have the platform. I guess what I would say in closing is I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to be with people who are so learned and also so candid. I don't think it's really easy to talk about this experience, as public as it is, of being harassed online, right? It's both a really intimate experience and a really public experience, but I hope that sharing and some provocative thoughts about government intervention versus free capitalism, flags flying, has been informative. It has been for me, and I feel like we're living in the middle of a revolution, right? Political, technological, so I hope we'll have the chance to talk again.
So, as my friend Mark Soka would say, amen to that. On May 3rd, just a moment, on May 3rd we'll have the final program of our series for the year. It'll be on Israel, 50 years after the 1967 war. You can believe that that will also be an interesting conversation. I really want to thank our panelists, Ari, Miriam, and Hadas. And Lisa, who did a phenomenal job moderating without a single note. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
A lot of the work we do at EDC is with youth and workforce readiness. And we're working in sub-Saharan Africa like Mali and Liberia.